later in life is when I decided to pursue this degree. I couldn't tell you how I necessarily came to this part in my journey. I'll give you like 30 seconds to a minute background on my life since St. Sebastian's. Went to Holy Cross, got a degree there, and for about the past 15 years, been running my own business. Still running it right now, doing video, web, and graphic design. So we're in marketing and design. Not really apologetics, not really similar industry whatsoever. Didn't study religious studies at Holy Cross. Had a degree in visual art. But something strange about the way God works in our lives is, oftentimes we're on our journeys. Every one of us is very unique. And none of us have the same journey. Some people know what they want to do right out of high school, right out of college. A lot of times, though, you kind of have to live life and let life sort of find you and where you're at. And that's what happened to me about 6 or 7 years ago. I just started asking some very tough questions that I never really asked hard before. Questions about the Bible, questions about scripture, and I had specific questions. Is it really true? Is it up for interpretation? There's just a lot going on right now, a lot of confusion out there. And so I kind of made a concerted effort to give a very objective approach to the Bible's claims and just start asking some of the hardest questions I could think of. And what I found was there's people who have PhDs that dedicate their careers to answering almost every single one of these questions, which is very interesting to me. So I got really involved in just studying apologetics independently, simply just to answer some of the questions I had. So that was kind of my journey. Did a lot of fun stuff in the meantime. But this is where I'm at right now. I decided to pursue a degree because I really feel that passionately about it, just how much it changed me, my approach, my family dynamic, my business. I mean, just putting God first and having that foundation of faith, knowing that, these toughest answers that I, really threw everything at, they still came out that the Christian way of life, the Christian view, what is preached in the Bible is the best explanation for the way the world actually is. And these PhD holding scholars and, even people on the other side of the arguments, weighing both sides and being objective really helped me get to that point where I could actually, with my mind, not just my heart, my strength, but with my mind, put my faith in God. So that's really, what drove me to apologetics. And so what I wanted to do today was just basically give you guys a little intro to apologetics. A lot of you might not have heard about it before. And it's very interesting because it hasn't really quite broken into the mainstream, but it still is a very, it dates all the way back to our church fathers. So not necessarily classifying them as, apologists, but what I'm going to talk to you about today is we're all sort of called as Christians to be apologists, to practice apologetics. So if any of us really do have hope inside of us, we are called to give reasons for that hope. It's not really enough to say, I feel this inside me, and therefore, that's why I believe it. Now that's part of it. Absolutely, that's the heart. We have the heart for God, which means we put our heart and we put our intentions and put God first. When we talk to, say, an atheist that might be struggling with depression or something like that, that's not really a defense for your faith that's really going to really turn them and get them thinking. If you flip the script, if an atheist is trying to convince you of their worldview, they might say something, oh, I don't believe God exists, but that's just kind of how I feel. Are you convinced that that's really a great case that they're making? No, they might show me evidence, show me some reasons why you have that worldview. So in 1 Peter 3:15, that's kind of what we talk about is in terms of the rallying call for all apologists. I don't know if anybody has a Bible, if they want to read that verse out loud. I get a volunteer. Are those all yours, or are those just always there waiting for you? That's pretty cool.
Always there.
You always know where to find one. You need it. 1 Peter 3:15. You want to read it?
Yes.
Yeah, 1 Peter 3:15. Important. Take note of this verse. I might write it on the board here, but yeah, read it out loud if you would.
But in your hearts, reverence Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to make a defense to anyone who calls you to account for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and reverence.
Awesome. You say it one more time, very loud, very loud. This is important.
But in your hearts, reverence Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to make a defense to anyone who calls you to account for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and reverence.
So always be prepared to make a defense. That word in Greek, apologia, that's where we get apologetics. So it's not saying I'm sorry, that's kind of a more modern definition. The Greek word apologia is to make a case, make a defense. And so that's what Peter is saying. He's saying always be prepared to give a defense for the hope that you have. And what's the last part of it? What's the last last sentence he says? But with?
Yet do it with gentleness and reverence.
With gentleness and reverence. So in the past, apologetics had, maybe in around the turn of the century, it was more about debating, and apologists almost got a bad rap for being too harsh with the facts and too harsh with trying to win the argument, but rather than win the person. So gentleness and respect, that's what Peter also calls us to do. That's weighing grace and truth together. So that's the heart of apologetics, is the 1 Peter 3:15 call. And that word apologia comes up throughout other parts in scripture as well. It's just a very important, yet a lot of times overlooked verse in the Bible. But that's what we're all called to do. We're not all called to be professional apologists, but if we're Christians, or if we claim to want to convince anybody or really show our Christianity, this is what we need to be doing. We need to have reasons. So that's the intellectual part of our faith, is having the reasons for the hope that we have. I want to do a fun little experiment. I brought a $10 bill here. Kind of gives you a little bit of a sense of what we've got. Let's start the class with this. All right. So we're gonna put George on trial here. Just the gavel. All right. This will filter into what we're doing later on in class, but so George here, I'll act as the prosecution. All right. I'm gonna say, as the prosecution, that I believe he was a fictional character. I mean, there's no photographic evidence of him. This was before photography. There's no video footage of George Washington. Anybody who ever knew him or knew of him has long since passed away, and potentially even their children have passed away. So I'm going to make the case as the prosecution that this man never existed. So prove me wrong. Give me a couple reasons why I should believe that George Washington actually did exist.
There's a writing that there's factual evidence that he's written certain things and it's been passed along to new generations.
Man, it's been a long time since I've written on a whiteboard. Yeah, so written record. All right, what else?
There's documents and photos and first president.
What sort of documents?
The Oval Office or the office itself. And the
Yeah, so multiple sources, multiple written sources, yeah, multiple documents. Okay, what else?
It kind of goes with written record, but like the signatures off of like everything he did, like the Declaration of Independence, for example, everything.
Yeah, what about the Declaration of Independence? Is that part of culturally, what do we say about that? If he actually affected that, like, how could we sort of
Associate that we live with modern life in America.
Yeah, there's a fallout of his actions, right? There's effects of his actually being here. So yeah, call it fallout.
There's like his house. Some of his garments have been sold and stuff.
Sure. So he's not quite that old, but artifacts. Anything else?
Like paintings of him.
What's that?
Like paintings of George Washington.
Paintings, yeah. So there's some depictions of him. Yeah, good. All right, now we are thinking, all right. I really thought I'd have to leave this. You guys are doing great. What else?
Like his house and his like complex.
Yeah. I think that kind of goes like, I should probably use another word besides artifacts, but yeah. Let's say a funny word, relics. Yeah.
There are stories passed down about him.
Yeah, stories passed down. Like written record / yeah. I think we've got plenty here. So yeah, written record, multiple sources, fallout, artifacts. Now, can we say 100%? that George Washington existed?
No, but
Why, yes.
just like, it's been, I don't know.
I mean, he's on this, but like, this could have just been,
Guaranteed.
the nation could have potentially, needed some sort of symbol when they were first starting out, and they just, made up this man that was larger than life apparently, how many did he absorb, like 20-something bullets? I forgot, he was like the unkillable president, I forgot what they called him, but it could have just been a piece of folklore. I mean, we don't have any photographic evidence, so 100%.
But it's still 100% though.
Well, if that's your standard, yeah.
Well, like with Uncle Sam, like he was just,
Yeah.
and like,
Uncle
Yeah.
Sam, George Washington,
Well, I don't think-
hundreds of years ago. Yeah.
because everyone knows he's not real. But,
Yeah.
I mean, technically, George Washington.
Anybody ever seen the Truman Show?
Yeah.
Yeah. So he thought that was his reality, but who knows? It could have been a dome over it. So anyway, the point is, I don't believe any scholar would ever say that 100%. But we have every reason to practically think that it's the most probable outcome that yes, George Washington did exist. So the evidence seems to point that George Washington did exist when Wade objected. So I agree with that. And so this is kind of a quick exercise in apologetics. How do we actually determine if something actually happened in the past? Whoever has seen any of those crime scene shows where they do like cold cases. Anybody know what a cold case is? Yeah, it's a cold case.
A case that wasn't solved, but it's kind of like left it there.
Yeah, there's no body. There, it's maybe decades old, and they revisit the case. They reopen the file. They brush off the dust, and they take another crack at it to see who the perpetrator could have been. So that's what we have to do with any historical claim. We have to examine the evidence. We have to examine everything that you guys wrote here. The fallout, the artifact, the relics, the depiction, the multiple sources. We have to go back and find everything that's circumstantial to eventually make our case as to what actually happened. What is that historical claim? Did that person actually exist? Did that event actually take place in history? Can't know with 100% certainty, but we can know enough beyond a reasonable doubt, as they would in a trial, what actually happened based on the evidence that we have. And so that's exactly what apologetics does in a lot of circumstances when it talks about events that happened in history. How do we weigh that? How can we tell that? What evidences do we have to back that up? And so, great job on that exercise. So let's just talk a little bit about who is called to be apologists, and who are some of the past apologists we've had in history, and who are some modern day apologists. So, like I said, 1 Peter 3:15, all of us are called to be apologists. Now, some people do it as a full-time job, but most apologists are actually scholars in a particular area, but they just happen to have converted to Christianity as well, because they've been completely convinced by their journeys, looking at the evidence, that that's where it eventually led them. Funny enough, of all the PhD holding apologists that we follow in our programs, I would venture to say nearly, if not slightly more than half of them, started out as atheists, believe it or not. And this is an important fact, because a huge obstacle that often gets in the way of apologetics is our biases. We call it our horizons, things like our viewpoints, our biases, things that we inherently just developed, even subconsciously, over the years. So, it depends on, the types of house environment that we grew up in, the region of the country we grew up in, the faith that we grew up with. These can be good things. They can absolutely be good things, but we have to acknowledge them before we start looking at things objectively. It's one of the hardest things to do, is to just be aware that you see the world differently than somebody else. You have a totally different experience than somebody else might have had. So you might be looking things just through a slightly different veil than someone else. And so these former atheists that are now dedicating their lives and their studies to apologetics, what they did was they first were scathing at the faith. Many of them were like scathing atheists. They used to take pleasure in tearing down Christians. And it's not a new thing. But what they did was they actually, to their credit, objectively looked at the evidence. They objectively looked at the facts. They objectively said, all right, I'm going to prove this thing wrong, and I'm going to make sure my case is bulletproof. And what happened was the exact opposite. They ended up coming to the faith. They said, oh my goodness, this was actually true. These claims are actually true, and I credit them. And they're some of the most strongest defenders of the faith out there, and have had probably the largest influence, because there's just as much of an onslaught on the other side with atheists trying to tear down the religion. And it's not just atheists either. And I don't want to even paint atheists in a negative way at all, because sometimes we need to sharpen our own skills, or there needs to be, a very glaring need to defend the faith. Society needs to be on attack sometimes in order to better itself. And that's what a lot of these atheists did back in the early 2000s. There were some very popular atheists that were just spewing this venom towards the Christian faith, the likes of Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris, and they still are to this day, many of them. But these were intellectual men, but they challenged a new breed of Christians to really take the faith a lot more seriously. Just carrying on as business as usual just wasn't enough anymore. We had to up the game intellectually. And that's exactly what happened. An incredible breed of apologists really stepped up, and there were some very productive debates. You can see all these debates online. And that's one thing that I'll say about apologetics too. There's a lot of proof that we can have internally, say that for me, like, yeah, that's absolute proof. We can't use that P word too loosely. There is such a high standard in apologetic scholarship for presenting something as verifiable evidence. We can't just say, oh, I believe this, or this seems like it could have been true, but no. We have to weigh it against lots of sources, both biblical and extra biblical. Who knows what extra biblical means? Like outside of the Bible. So it's not enough to say Jesus Christ existed because the Bible says. What does that mean to an atheist? But when you say that Jesus Christ existed because Jewish scholarship has written about him, Jewish historians who were alive back then reported on him, or Roman historians reported on him, these are outside of Christianity, people writing about Jesus Christ, not just Jesus, but his crucifixion. And so I'm going to get into something right now called the minimal facts surrounding Christ. And you'd be surprised to know that at the very highest of scholarship levels, this is atheist scholarships, these are Christian scholars, these are non-Christian scholars. I'm going to present you with 4 minimal facts that all of these scholars agree on. And the way I put this is, if you try to bring up one of these issues and go against what I'm about to tell you, you might be right, you might be wrong, but you will get laughed out of a room of scholars, both atheists and Christians, that have done the research work, that have done the PhD work. So this might be a little surprising for you guys to hear, but these are what we call the minimal facts. So Gary Habermas, Mike Lacona, they're probably the top Christian apologists that research specifically the resurrection event. And some of these minimal facts will carry into just general facts about Christ. But just think about these facts, and think about some of the objections you might have heard to Christianity, and basically where that might be coming from if you know these minimal facts. So again, these are attested by both atheist scholars and Christian scholars and non-Christian scholars who have studied these events at the scholarship level and have that standard. So number 1, Jesus Christ did exist, and he was crucified. So again, scholarship will laugh you out of a room if you try to say that Jesus Christ didn't exist. And I think we all know that inherently, but there's plenty of people out there that say, it's been so long, it's been 2,000 years, he might not have existed, Jesus might not have existed. Just because it's just a little longer ago doesn't necessarily mean that you can just make that case without any evidence. You do the slightest little bit of research and digging and seeing where the evidence lies, you'll absolutely come to the conclusion that this guy existed and Jesus Christ existed. And that's what atheistic scholarship and Christian scholarship has determined. So Christ did exist. We have actually more of a full biography closer to the date of his existence than we have on Alexander the Great. And I don't think there's a single shred of scholarship out there that would ever deny that Alexander the Great existed. Yet Christ's existence is attested in his full biographies at a much earlier date than Alexander the Great, very much closer to his actual passing. And so that's one line of evidence. Another minimal fact, we call this bedrock, we call this foundation, like minimal fact. We say that appearances were reported of his resurrected body. So nobody denies in scholarship that people actually went around claiming that they saw the risen Christ. Does that mean that he rose from the dead? No, that does not point to that. But people claimed that he did. And that's gone on fact as well. So the appearances were reported of his resurrected body. I'm going to have somebody read another verse. Anybody else want to read a verse? So we're going to read a very important verse right now. And it's 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8. I'm getting good, I can get a little better by the time you here. 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8. Got it, buddy? Yep.
For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, and that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures, and that he appeared to Tobias, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one ultimately born, he appeared also to me.
All right. There's a lot to unpack there and a lot to chew on, but let me break it down for you very simply. So this is the Apostle Paul talking about something that he received. So it means Paul actually received this information from elsewhere. And he's not speaking like a regular conversation I would have with Father Arms. He's speaking in creedal form. That this happened, that happened, that this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. This is a creed that was passed down to Paul, which means it had probably been circulating. It wasn't a brand new creed that was just created that week, that month. No, at least a couple of years it takes a creed to circulate that which was passed down to him. What are some of the things that he said? He said that Christ, they go through all the passions right there, that Christ was crucified, that he rose again, and that he appeared. So he first appears to Peter, Cephas, and then he appears to, what does it say next?
12.
The 12. Who are the 12?
Apostles.
Yep. And then
More than 500.
500 people. Now, talk is cheap. We get that. But Paul is saying he appeared to 500 people. Minimal facts that people claimed that Christ appeared. It wasn't just one person. It wasn't just one person that saw the risen Christ and ran around telling everybody. That's not something that we could really defend. But 500 people. He goes even further than that in this creed. He says, what does he say in the next line? Many
of whom are still alive.
Ask them. He says, you don't believe me? Ask them. Many of them are still alive today. Now, when did Paul actually receive this creed? So we have evidence of Paul actually visiting Jerusalem within 2 years after the resurrection event itself. This is, guys, this right here is the earliest attestation to any historical event in the ancient Near East. This puts us within a couple of years of the resurrection event itself. You don't make up a story and claim that something was made up years and decades, if not centuries later, that some of these thin scholars are actually depicting. No, this puts us right at the foot of the cross. This is a couple of years. And it was already circulated at that time. So this is a very important verse that tells you that, as close as we can possibly get to proof that this is what people saw. That 500 people saw this event And if you don't believe them, go right over there and ask them. Many of them are still alive right now. So I would absolutely write down that particular line of evidence, because for me, that was the hardest one for me to ignore when I learned that in our resurrection studies class. A couple other bedrock minimal facts that atheist scholars and Christian scholars will agree on is that skeptics of Christ were among those who have viewed his risen body. So James, the half-brother of Jesus, he was a skeptic of Christ. He thought he was a lunatic. He thought he was crazy. There's plenty of evidence in the Bible that shows that James and the rest of Christ's family didn't even believe who he was, with the exception of his mother. And even his mother, at times, was a little embarrassed by some of his antics, but still, his brother was a skeptic. And then the Apostle Paul, who knew what the Apostle Paul did before he was transformed on the road to me?
He stole like a fruit.
I think it's a little Satine, but worse than that.
Christians.
Oh, he killed Christians. He prosecuted Christians. He was hired by the Jewish government to break up any gatherings of Christians. And he confesses this in Acts. He confesses this in other in some of his writings, that Paul was. Well, he doesn't confess it in Acts, but in his letters, he confesses the atrocities that he committed against Christians. Paul was, the equivalent of a hatred group that's out there that tries to murder Christians, like an ISIS even. I mean, this is the level of evil that Paul inflicted upon the Christians. Yet Paul ends up writing more in the New Testament than any other writer because of that conversion experience. So skeptics were among those who claimed to have seen the risen Christ. And then finally, like we said, the early testimony. So nobody denies that, we have early testimony of the resurrection event. Nobody denies that at all. And they're just such high standards for, and this is what I learned in grad school. The standards are just ridiculously high to even pass anything off as scholarship, and for good reason too. All right, so closing up here, guys. There are other attested minimal facts too. So these aren't necessarily bedrock, but they're all everything but bedrock. I mean, these are as close to facts as we can get. Christianity exploded after the resurrection event. So even if we can't prove the resurrection, we can prove that there was a fallout after the resurrection. Christianity exploded all over the world. Something happened in Jerusalem in 33 AD that caused this to just explode worldwide. Apostles that were going into hiding during the actual crucifixion event suddenly had the faith of a lion and were willing to put their lives at risk, and many actually did die gruesome deaths for what they believed they saw. It wasn't an ideology that they believed, it was for something they saw, which is a big difference. People can get brainwashed into ideologies and die for that cause, but if you die for something that you claim you saw after you were in hiding before, and then you saw something, that's a different type of level of proof that you can offer. So these apostles were willing to go to their graves, and almost every single one of them did, for what they claimed they saw. So that's another line of evidence. Other things to prove this wasn't fake, females were the first to view the body, and there's other embarrassing self-defeating details within the Gospels. You don't write these things if you're writing a lie. You don't write these things that might incriminate you later on, because a woman's testimony in ancient Near East was almost laughable. It was not worth much, but the Gospels are chock full of female testimonies, the first to see Christ. And then embarrassing details. You don't write embarrassing details about yourself if you plan to create a religion and make yourself out to be the hero, so to speak. So why are there embarrassing details? It's because this is what actually happened. They actually denied Christ. Peter denied Christ. He wouldn't write that detail in there, but Peter's rebuked by Jesus over and over throughout the gospel. So it's hard to believe that he would actually make those things up. And then yes, the circulation, like we had talked about before. So, but probably like the last bit of evidence I'll tell you before we can maybe ask some questions about this, is the empty tomb. Just provide the body of Christ and this whole thing's over. But clearly, all these different excuses were made up to point to something. The fact that scholarship is trying or has been trying to figure out some sort of explanation for the empty tomb What does that kind of prove? That there was an empty tomb. If they'd found the body, game over. So there's one last verse I want you to read, and that's 1 Corinthians 15:14. You have 1 Corinthians written out, so just listen to 15:14.
If Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain, and your faith is in vain.
If Christ has not been raised, right?
Yes.
So if the resurrection didn't happen, this is the Apostle Paul saying, if the resurrection didn't happen, then forget everything that we're teaching you. Our faith is in vain. Our hope is in vain. So Paul's saying it's kind of the linchpin of the entire Christian faith is the resurrection of Christ. And Paul acknowledges this. He's like, this is the evidence that I'm presenting you. This is why I'm presenting you this evidence. So with that being said, I want to go back to our one of our Catholic apologists, which is C.S. Lewis, which I'm sure you've read a little bit of C.S. Lewis. Who knows what C.S. Lewis said about let's talk about what C.S. Lewis first said about Christ. Who knows some famous analogy he made? It's the 3 L's. Anybody know the 3 L's? Very good. So scholarship says that Christ existed, so it's your job to kind of decide, who was he? Was he a Lord, or was he a liar, or was he a lunatic? He's got to be one of the 3, because of the claims that he made was that he and the Father are one, or before Abraham was, I am. These are claims pretty much to be the same oneness with God. He's either a Lord, liar, or a lunatic. He's got to pick one of the 3. It can't be somewhere in the. And finally, the quote about Christianity that C.S. Lewis says. I love this because this really helps ground my faith a lot of the time. He says, in which book was this? Christ in the Dock. Christianity, if false, is of no importance. If true, of infinite importance. But only thing it cannot be is moderately important. So we have a decision to make with the evidence that we have. Are we on board or are we not on board? Is the evidence enough for us to really make that leap? It can't be moderately important. It's either of 0 importance or of infinite importance. So just remember that there's no room for moderation when it comes to this. Either these things happen in history and they have implications or they don't. So anyway, you guys have been great. This was a dream come true for me to be able to actually tell you all this information and somewhat teach a class, but just getting experience speaking to all of you has really meant a lot, and even coming back to my school here. And I'd love to, if you have a couple quick questions before we finish up. I know we only have a few minutes. I went a little over, but this was awesome, guys. Thank you so much. I encourage you ask questions. We might not have too much time here, but ask the questions. Don't hold them back. Don't bottle them in like I did for 20 years. Really just ask the questions. Your generation, you have so much information like at your fingertips. You guys are so inventive. You guys are so intuitive. Like you guys can absolutely crush anything you put your minds to, just with the innate abilities you guys have. You got that hunger for knowledge, you got that hunger for truth. Just really direct it in the right way. And if you have doubts or if you have any sort of questions, you have wonderful resources here at your disposal. Just really don't hold back. Just really ask those questions. What do we got? A couple minutes?
Yeah, about 5 minutes.
Yeah, 5 minutes. Any questions about apologetics or anything that we talked
The
about?
percentage of atheists, apologists that end up converting to Catholicism?
Percentage of atheist apologists. It's probably, and you're talking about Catholicism as a
Or ones
specific.
that you said a good amount of those who are apologists started out as atheists. What percentage of those ends up converting to Catholicism?
It's a good question. So the reason why people, I guess, would do that first and foremost, this is probably the hardest thing to shed, is they took an objective approach to it. So many atheists or so many non-Christians will take a very much, I guess, emotional or volitional approach rather than an intellectual approach. They don't want it to be true. So they're kind of going with that horizon first and foremost. I would say it's probably fairly small, but I'd say of the ones that actually put the work in and shed that horizon, I I would put my money on saying the majority of them would probably arrive at that conclusion if they do scholarly work that they should be doing. Great question.
In Christian apologetics, do you talk about why like bad things happen to good people? Like
Yeah.
cancer and heart attacks.
Absolutely. So yeah, I should have gone over this earlier, but some of the popular topics are the problem of evil, scientific apologetics, how does science and religion kind of relate to one another, the authority of the Bible, ethics, morality, resurrection. But what your question is probably one of the number one questions that people ask. Why does evil exist in this world? Why is there suffering? And understanding God's nature and understanding, well, first and foremost, when somebody asks that question, you want to find out, or where's this question coming from? You want to find out, what is their background, what's leading up to them asking about this? Because a lot of times they're asking that question from a very specific place. And so that's what you want to consider first and foremost. And then when you talk about justice, God's justice, am I asking the question based on an emotion that I'm feeling at the moment? And is that emotion separate from God's actual nature and the justice that God's given? But yeah, absolutely. Huge part of apologetics is diving deep into that. And I think almost more scholarship writing has probably been written on that than most other topics. So that's an incredible area to study. They call it a theodicy. It's the question of why God allows evil and suffering. Yeah.
Have you researched that? Learn about it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you have an answer?
It's not like snapping your fingers, but it's knowing God's nature. If you know God's nature, you know God's love for us involves giving us a free will. If God didn't give us a free will, and first of all, what is evil? Evil's not something like you see on Spider-Man 3 that falls from space and attacks Venom and creates this creature, something, this black substance. No. Evil is a depravity of something good. And so what evil is compared to like a cancer in a body, you have a body that's a good thing, and then cancer attacks the body. So a body without cancer, this is something that apologist St. Frank Turek says, a body without cancer is a wonderful body. But what's cancer without a body? Nothing. So that's what evil is. It's the depravity of something that's good. But the reason why God might allow suffering, first of all, sometimes, he does intervene. Sometimes he does stop bad things from happening. Other times he doesn't. We need a world where we can rely on certain things and laws, happening and taking place. But God also gives us room to, and again, this is just covering over the subject. I would love to have a longer conversation to see where this is coming from. But if God really loved us, he would give us free will. He wouldn't force us to love him. He wouldn't force us to always act good or do the right thing. That's not loving. That's not free will. Our free will is our responsibility, what we do with it. So much evil in the world, even natural evil that happens, a lot of it, if you dig deep enough, it comes down to humans polluting something that's good. And so it's, again, just the tip of the iceberg of that issue, but it absolutely is something that all of you should really consider hard. And looking into the nature of God, you'll start to see there's not very much disconnect in terms of what actually does happen and what God allows. But then miracles do happen as well, and God does on occasion intervene. Great question. Yeah.
So, what would you say to people who see like the core values of the church and it preaches loving people and apologies teaching? What do you say about like let's say the huge problem with years back, like with priests doing some horrible things, and
Sure.
people don't want to fund or be a part of something that maybe looks away from part of those problems, but still preach that you have to be good, you have to be loving. But the people who spread the gospel of the Lord are still doing these things. So
Yeah.
we say to those people who don't want to be a part of a community that's sometimes like that.
Yeah, I'll be objective here and I'll say about any faith whatsoever. We're called not to judge a faith by the abuse of it. The faith itself needs to be on the standard of what it preaches, what it says. Problem with Christianity is me, it's you, it's all of us. We're human. We're fallen beings. We're in flesh bodies. We have a fallen nature. We abuse things that are good. And so Christianity itself, are the claims good? You have to see what the claims of the faith are. And are people acting in accordance with that? Or are they acting in hypocrisy? Are they acting against that? We don't judge the faith by the abuse of it. We judge the faith as the objective standards that it preaches itself. That's an excellent question.
You talked a lot about like, there's evidence that he exists, and it's basically the fact that he did. But is it a fact that he should be like worshipped, or he is part of God? You know what I mean?
I think it goes back to what his claims were. So in terms of the bedrock evidence, we don't go as far as to say that atheistic scholars would say that he was God. That's separate. We're just saying at least scholarship shows that he existed. So when people come at you and say, oh, Christ never existed, or nobody knows that for sure, you can tell them, well, you'll get laughed out of a room of atheistic scholars if you say that. So that's really where that evidence goes. But in terms of what his claims were, and as C.S. Lewis says, he's either a Lord, liar, lunatic. You have to pick between the three. The Bible actually tells what Jesus said about himself. So Jesus didn't say he was just a good moral teacher. No, Jesus made higher claims than that. He claimed to be one with God, Son of God. And so that's where we go with the kind of the next level, saying, all right, well, we have this guy, Jesus. Now what do we do with him? All right, this is what he claimed. And so that's the question people need to ask rather than did he exist? We're past that.
All right, guys. Good question.
You guys are amazing. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.